Okay, hi, my name is Madeline Salas. This is my presentation on adjustment disorder for diagnosis and treatment on line B with Dr. Rika Farago. Okay, well, let's get into it. Okay, the history of adjustment disorder actually started in the 50s when it was first listed in the first DSM, but it was not called adjustment disorder. It was called transient situational personality disorder. That turned into transient situational disturbances in the late 60s, 70s. And then in the DSM 3 in 1980 was when we finally saw it being called adjustment disorder. Um, yeah, so that's kind of the history of like the name and why we were calling it that. While it was called all of those names, it basically was like very like under researched and not well understood because adjustment disorder is frankly like hard to diagnose because it contains like so much of other possible disorders that like narrowing it down to this, you really have to do a lot of like digging into the criteria, being really specific with it. Yeah, and I'll get into that in when we get into the diagnostic criteria. Um, in an article from Johns Hopkins University, they kind of talk about the history of adjustment disorder and how um, it has been criticized for being too loose, which I thought was funny phraseology because, yeah, they like described it as being too loose because there has just been like records of it being misdiagnosed, like I was just saying, like being diagnosed as major depressive disorder, being diagnosed as post traumatic stress disorder or acute stress disorder, which are like the top three differential diagnoses to rule out when you're diagnosing adjustment disorder. Getting into the rest of the history. Um, Sorry, just catching up on me notes. Yeah, so in the late 1978, there was a study done by Looney and Gunderson. Dr. Looney, he was actually a naval officer who had been in World War II. So he was doing a study on other naval officers and like naval army members, how they were not reacting, but how they were like adjusting basically back into society. And um, so this is when we were still calling it right transient situational disturbances. Um, and in this study, he was looking at a small group that he was looking at was these naval officers, and then they were also looking more generally in um, all these like crisis oriented service facilities. So ERs, health centers at colleges, mental health clinics for emergencies, which kind of ties into what I'm going to talk about at the end in terms of crisis counseling, because it was around this time that they found they were diagnosing adjustment disorders with the rise of crisis intervention theory, like kind of becoming a thing, which that happened like after and around the end of World War II when we had all these soldiers coming home who were severely traumatized, but we didn't really, have the words for what these people were experiencing. Um, and then later we saw that, with like the Vietnam War and those soldiers coming back and not having any mental health support. This is like the same thing just before that. Um, so yeah, this same study showed like the increased frequency of diagnoses, um, they were describing it as a gross stress reaction and also kind of looping it into this thing called adult situational reactions. Basically, kind of like separating it into this I lost my train of thought. Separating it into this like separate response that was like very specific, kind of like how the onset of PTSD was when that was like first being researched and like explored. Yeah, and then the crisis intervention theory, all of this kind of coming out at the same time. Getting into the diagnostic criteria in the DSM-5, so on this more finalized understanding of adjustment disorder that we have so far, it's described as a stress or trauma-induced condition that does meet the criteria, that does not meet the criteria for another mental disorder, nor is it an exacerbation of a pre-existing mental condition. So something that's really important with adjustment disorder, and I think is the like the most specific thing to adjustment disorder, is the time frame. So it must begin within 3 months of onset of the stressor or like the stressful event that's come up for the client. And then it must like not be persisting for more than an additional 6 months after this stressful event or onset of a stressor has ended. So yeah, these were just a couple little cutouts I had taken from the DSM, talking about basically what are the symptoms. So we have marked distress that is out of proportion to the severity or intensity of the stressor, significant impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning, so just like work, school, interpersonal relationships. Another thing that is very specific to adjustment disorder is like a big stressor that can happen for people, obviously, is grief and loss of a loved one or a family member. So adjustment disorder is going to be different than this typical grieving process, and it's not representative of like the normal bereavement process that most people go through. There are a few specific specifiers that you have to include when you're diagnosing adjustment disorder. This includes with depressed mood, with anxiety, with a mixed anxiety and depressed mood, disturbance of conduct, and then with mixed disturbance of emotions and conduct, and then unspecified, where it's a little more vague or maybe more of a amalgamation of all of those things. The diagnostic features, so yeah, just continuing what we were talking about. So yeah, how I was kind of talking about grief. We also have like multiple events of stress. So something that can be the onset specific to adjustment disorder can either be a single event or a recurrent event, or different than recurrent, like a continuous event. So a single specific event would be like a breakup, marital problems, might be like a breakup, or yeah, marital problems, which is like a recurrent single event because it's like the same thing, it just keeps happening over and over again. And then there's also continuous, so having like a persistent new onset of like a disability, like a later in life disability, or like perhaps a cancer diagnosis. We also have like living in a crime-filled neighborhood, so maybe where it's a situational continuous stressor that is like obviously on and on, affecting like how the client lives their life and copes with stress in their life. So yeah, what I found most interesting about this was the connection with grief, and how we often see adjustment disorder diagnosed when it's associated with the death of a loved one. because the grief symptoms are going to exceed what is like normally expected. But that also includes like taking into effect cultural or religious or age related when you have children can be diagnosed with adjustment disorder, like the norms for what those are. And specific to this, you have to be able to rule out that it is not persistent complex bereavement disorder, which is a whole other thing. So yeah, just like having to get all this down, I think that just really like hits home how complicated adjustment disorder is to diagnose because there are so many other things that it could be. Getting into the risk factors was very interesting as well because the only thing in the DSM that I found was it said that adjustment disorder is environmental. Quote, individuals from disadvantaged life circumstances experience a high rate of stressors and may be at an increased risk for adjustment disorders. And I took this to relate with what was on the previous slide about like living in a crime-filled neighborhood. So like when we apply that to risk factors, we think, okay, well, what kinds of groups of people are like living in areas with a high rate of stressors? Poor people. Who happens to be like makes up the majority of poor people in a lot of areas? People of color. So you have like all of those risk factors stemming from one situational slash environmental circumstance. Yeah, so like each person's life experience is different, and obviously how we cope with stress is different. And each person, I think, is at a different level of risk for adjustment disorder, not only based on their situational like stressors, but also based on their current mental health status, if they have any other mental health disorders, or if they're maybe don't. And so they're like in that section, they would have less of a risk of adjustment disorder related to that. If they have childhood stress that could show itself later in life when somebody begins processing something, or just like multiple stressors at one time, maybe living in an area with high crime, having parents who are going through marital problems, and then losing a sibling, like all of those things, can happen to one person. That's not like an anomaly. Unfortunately, those kind of situations are quite common where people have a lot of bad things happening to them at once, and how they cope is a whole other thing, and then leads to like where we get into having a diagnosis like adjustment disorder, like they're just not able to cope with life. Yeah, I found this also interesting from an article from the Mayo Clinic. Major stressors for adjustment disorder don't have to be like negative only, they can also be positive changes. So just like moving, like that's not necessarily always a negative situation. It could be for a good reason, but like in doing so, it might bring up a lot of stressors for the client. Then also like having a baby, it's like a positive, happy thing, right? But if the person who's experiencing the adjustment disorder does not have like the support system needed, or the coping strategies, or like the communication skills, they're not going to be able to handle this sudden change. So yeah, there's just that list just continues on other risk factors for adjustment disorder. So pretty wide. So diagnosis for adjustment disorder. It's really important to have a detailed personal history of your client's life and all of the different stressful slash like just event stressors that could have happened in their life. These details kind of allow the practitioner to either like the client will know what event or stressor is causing their issue, like why they are in counseling, or the practitioner will be able to pinpoint okay, I think maybe it was this event, like you going through a divorce, that um, kind of began this onset of symptoms. Um, Also, having a psychiatric interview, I found a really great article. Not even an article; it was like a journal that walked you through the steps of a psychiatric interview and how you, as the counselor, can go through it to like bringing in a lot of like the ethical guidelines that we learn in the APA handbook, and then also just like, yeah, teaching you how to approach the client with empathy, and then what are those steps that like how are you going to get to like your specific treatment plan, and just basically going through like, okay, you have to like start easy, you have to like ease yourself and the client into this interview process. It was really fascinating. um yeah, I kind of talked about this at the beginning, but yeah, just like how important it is to rule out the differential diagnoses, um because like adjustment order disorder is really common. Like we're going to go, I think in the next couple slides it says how um, often adjustment disorder is diagnosed daily in like a mental hospital. I believe it was 50% of the like majority of cases. Um, but like if you don't have the, I think like proper training and the proper tools, it can just be diagnosed as something completely different. So like major depressive disorder, PTSD, acute stress disorder, a personality disorder. It might get misconstrued as like just a psychological condition from a different medical condition, or like from medication, or it could just be um, diagnosed as a normative stress reaction, which then I think, it just leaves the client not getting the proper help that they need. So yeah, in this next little blurb, um, this kind of just listed some more ways of how to go about psychiatric interview. So administering like a PTSD scale test to either eliminate or to diagnose PTSD. And so if you can rule out PTSD, then you just have to go through this long list kind of all these other possible diagnoses. Yeah, like measuring the quality of life. So that also, I think, relates into having this um, detailed personal history on your client. And then anxiety rating, disability. Yeah, just all of this is relating to the quality of life. And just like making sure that you're actually able to come to the accurate conclusion of adjustment disorder, and that you're not misdiagnosing your client and then like, setting them on this whole like journey that's, not going to end up being as helpful as the treatment for adjustment disorder would actually be. So some cultural and ethical considerations to consider. I thought it was just important to reiterate how important it is to respect the client's autonomy, um, because, and I kind of connected it, I was really interested obviously in like how adjustment disorder is linked to grief and like um, the loss of a loved one just for people, and how like big of an impact that has on everyone in like different ways. Like we're told that the grieving process is this one way, and like I get that it is for the most part. We wouldn't have like the 7 steps of grief or whatever if it wasn't accurate for most people. But that's why I think it's just important to consider the client's autonomy, um, as well as their cultural background. Another thing that I thought was really important was also knowing that, like, yes, you are there to respect your client's boundaries, but like you need to know if your client is in need of immediate crisis help, i.e., like put on a suicide hold or having a police intervention if you know that they have a plan at home, and doing whatever you can to like intervene and stop harm from happening, basically harm reduction. Um, yeah, and then going back to the grieving process. Um, yeah, because I just think when I think about how different cultures have different um, like processes for dealing with death, like in the Hindu religion, you know, there's a 13, 10 to 13 days of mourning, and that is like the only time when you're supposed to be, like right after someone has died, that is when you're supposed to be doing all of your grieving. You're not allowed to go to a religious temple. You're just like supposed to process all your grief. And then I just think about how we're taught about grief from a Western perspective. It's very private. Um, and you're not supposed to like share that with anyone else. You're supposed to process this all on your own, versus in a lot of not Western civilizations, grief is a very like community oriented process where you are supposed to like everyone knows that you are grieving and they know like how hard you are supposed to be grieving or like how hard you are grieving. So yeah, just considering that when you're dealing with clients so that you can like make an informed decision on their diagnoses. Like, you know, just because you think your client is having this like outlandish response to a death of someone in their life, like using like a critical cultural lens to look at that situation, I think is always going to be beneficial. Okay, treatment for adjustment disorder. So, like most things, I think a CBT approach is going to be the most appropriate, and in links to adjustment disorder, is found to be most beneficial because it contains multitudes. Um, you know, there's problem solving skills to work on, communication when there's interpersonal relationships, impulse control if somebody is going through dealing with death, you know, controlling their impulses and then also their emotions and not making any like drastic decisions, anger management, same thing, and just like stress management overall. And basically being able to like guide your client in building that skill set, building like that tool belt. In CBT, that's so important of like, okay, what can I, like having that, so that's like the thing is having like your tool belt with all your different skills. And so that when you go into different situations where you know, like, here's something, a very stressful situation I'm about to go into, what can I take from my little tool belt that will help me in this situation and guide me? Family and group therapy were two other really big ones I saw in my research for treatment of adjustment disorder, um, which I think just ties into like having that emotional support um, for the client dealing with adjustment disorder, and also like having a peer group. Like this applies for most things, like when we talked about or like how I shared about what are the um, possible stressors for adjustment disorder, like having a support group for death, for losing a loved one, for a grief support group, having a support group for if you're a person with a disability or like a newly onset disability, finding a support group of people who are in the same position and being able to build those connections and have that support. Another one that was really big was if you experienced a natural disaster and then having to cope with the aftermath of that. Um, like having other people around you who have gone through that same thing or even going through the same thing right now, to just like build that community. I think community outreach is like so important with all counseling, especially. Yeah, and this was just something I wanted to add about crisis counseling. I took crisis counseling the course last semester, and I thought that class was like really amazing. And blah, blah, blah. It especially tied to adjustment disorder because a lot of the event stressors that trigger adjustment disorder are from a crisis, like are from a crisis standpoint, like something happening all of a sudden that was not expected. So yeah, just I wanted to touch on these things like having a resource guide for your clients who are local to you. This means you have multiple resources of suicide hotlines, support groups like I was just talking about, mental health facilities in the areas, cultural resources, whether that's cultural groups for clients from a different cultural background than you. Like just having a list of resources. That was one thing we had to do, is create like a list of 30 different local resources for clients, and this is just something you're going to build on in your career as a counselor. Yeah, and then the first couple things there: define the problem, ensure safety, provide support, examine alternatives, and make a plan. And these are kind of the 5 basic steps of crisis counseling, like when you are thrown into that emergency situation for you as the counselor, like what to do. And yeah, just using your peers to help support you supporting your client. We're not always going to have all the answers, and we're not going to be able to fix every problem. That's just an impossible standard to uphold. So, like, knowing that we have resources and peers who know more than you and who will be able to, like, help guide you into making the best decision for your client. Okay, and those are my references. I am going to stop recording. Thank you so much. I just recorded this after work, so sorry that was like so horrible.